when I give you the data that will say the racial wealth gap has increased $152,000 over the last 25 years. In fact, just about every single thing somebody could think about is going to explain a part of it. $152,000 is a huge bleed, and all cuts lead to that bleed. But it's our job, and what I've tried to take on here is to get at the most important, the key drivers of that $152,000 increase, and to put in perspective all of those so-called popular narratives that might explain a nickel of it.
Now, for years, one major thing that has always been discussed about the difference between whites and blacks in America is the existing disparity in incomes and wealth. And there are those who can explain this in a better way. But in today's video, I came across a clip that is quite interesting. It unravels the intrigues behind how the wealth gap within America, especially between blacks and whites, has always been sustained and maintained to be wide as it is today. Because no matter the year you are in, no matter how much progress people make, this disparity never seems to be closed. Let's watch this video to understand much of what is going on in America between blacks and whites.
So, you are both pioneers in the field. You've articulated how people who have assets can hold on to those assets and the consequences of that. Can you share with us your lens, research and analyses, and how it's evolved over time? Can you tell us about the critical lessons that you've learned that led you to our understanding of the racial wealth gap at this moment?
Sure. Let me take the first crack. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm the guy with the impossible expectations up here. Meant to tell you all about what the drivers of the increasing wealth gap look like. Let me tell you how I got there. In the fortunate opportunity I've had to do a lot of writing and talking to media and to general public and lots of audiences, it's amazing to me that I seriously can't think of one occasion where data around what the racial wealth gap is has been challenged. It's unassailable, and I think that we have built that foundation that nobody has attacked because, frankly, it's very, very difficult to attack. However, just as Alexis told us before, it's like a racial Rorschach test. When I talk about the racial wealth gap, everybody knows why that gap exists. Because, in fact, it builds into all of those implicit biases, and that social construction comes back at us. And you hear that in all kinds of ways. As I've been thinking about that, I've been trying to work on a project that tees up some evidence-informed policy at the same time that helps us shape an evidence-informed narrative that accounts for the largest pieces of the racial wealth gap, in particular the largest drivers of the increasing racial wealth gap. Because I think we all do understand that, in fact, when I give you the data that will say the racial wealth gap has increased $152,000 over the last 25 years, in fact, just about every single thing somebody could think about is going to explain a part of it. $152,000 is a huge bleed, and all cuts lead to that bleed. But it's our job, and what I've tried to take on here is to get at the most important, the key drivers of that $152,000 increase, and to put in perspective all of those so-called popular narratives that might explain a nickel of it. So, typically, I'm not sure where the sun is shining brightly on us, perhaps glaring out some of the slide here, but typically when we look at the racial wealth gap, we look at it at one point in time, and we see data like this, which is accurate. absolutely accurate. And it tells us that the gap is somewhere around $100,000. And we talk and think a lot about why that gap exists. And when we think about it at one point in time, we're looking at one bar in time, our brains, as they should, I think, go to the historical, the legacy, the sedimentation of inequality, because we're talking about a starting point, in a way. The perspective that I want to start to shift is when we ask the question, what happens over the course of a generation to that gap that we typically just look at one point in time? And here I don't know how clearly, again, people can see it, but the blue chart, the blue bars, the blue lines, is median wealth of a typical white family. The red is typical wealth, the median wealth of an African American family. This comes from a study, panel study of income dynamics that has followed the same set of families, and we're looking at it over a 25-year period. And what I think is really critical for us in terms of how we move forward, both in policy development and in shaping our own narrative, is to ask two key questions. One, what accounts for that increasing space between the blue and the red line, between the median white family and the median African American family, where that gap has basically tripled in real dollars up to now it's increased by $152,000 over the 25 years. And second, to ask, are the accumulators, the drivers of wealth, do they reward African Americans, and I think it will also apply to other minority groups as well, although the specifications need to be done differently than it does to whites. So, at this point in the work we're doing, we are very confident to make the following kinds of statements. Some of the key factors like work, like income, over the 25 years, returns wealth rewards very differently for African Americans than it does for whites. For the whole group that we're looking at, a dollar increase in income, each dollar increase in income over the 25 years returns about $5 in wealth to the average white family. That same dollar increase in income, each dollar, returns only 70 cents to the typical African American family. So the blue line heads up more by the same reward on the job and in the paycheck than the red African American line. And indeed, part of the story that is too often undertold, because we do tend to focus on the inequity, is the increase until fairly recently for African Americans. It's just that proportional increase is considerably less. The part of the work that I want to be intentionally hesitant and ambivalent about, because as we keep trying to test it and get it better, has to do with the key drivers. Not for publication, which is indeed why there's not a slide about this. We think we're at the point where we can account for about 60% of the proportional increase in the racial wealth gap, with by far the largest driver being home ownership over the 25 years. The number of years that a family has owned a home over those 25 years, in our estimate, and again, very ambivalent, very hesitant, we keep reworking it, accounts for about 40% of the increase in the racial wealth gap. It's that huge. All right. Now we can stop, and I think we will in the conversation a lot more, because I think it's really important there to think about that. What are the causes of that? How does it come to us? And we, I think, need to start with residential segregation being the linchpin of race relations and the structuring of how different groups accumulate wealth in the United States, and all of the dynamics around that. The other largest drivers, besides home ownership and work, have to do, not surprisingly, with inheritance. Only about, not about, 36% of whites in the sample we were looking at inherited more than $10,000. So most people don't inherit. We have to start there. But 36% of whites do, in comparison to about 7.2% of African Americans. So that's about a 4 or 5-fold differential there. And when whites do inherit, they tend to inherit considerably more dollars than African Americans do when they do inherit. The last largest driver I want to mention at the beginning here is education. And this we captured through college education. And here I think we see the classic racialized puzzle working itself out. I think it does in all the dynamics. But I think we see it perhaps most clearly in education, where a college degree clearly rewards, in terms of wealth and income, by the way, but just we're talking about wealth for the moment, clearly rewards blacks and whites. And is often a good starting point of advice for those of us that have growing children and those of us that teach. There is a huge payoff to a college education. But while that is a positive story for African Americans, the other part of the puzzle is that the same college degree returns considerably more wealth to the typical white family than the typical African American family. And I think part of the story there, which I can delve into perhaps in the conversation, has to do with student debt. And what happens, what derails students in the first place, the large debt burdens, that's considerably more for African Americans in terms of proportion than for white graduates in the class of 2010 and 2011, for example. Right. In a nutshell, those capture some of the key drivers in what the increase in the racial wealth gap is caused by. That perspective changes our lens, shifts the balance a little bit. We still talk about history, and the sedimentation of inequality is still very critical. But all of those areas I've just talked about have to do with policy and the institutionalization of racialized practice in the United States. That is, dynamics happening here, today, now, in our immediate past, and in our immediate future. For me, that is where I think the great hope of this kind of perspective takes us to. It takes us to looking at policy ways and institutional transformation that can begin to close the racial wealth gap. I believe that it also can help us point to a narrative around how to frame those kinds of issues in ways that we were precisely talking about earlier. And finally, at this point in time, you know what else it also does? It allows people like me and us to interrogate the narrative of others who think they know why the racial wealth gap exists. We can test with evidence child-rearing practices, marital status, and other more culturally and behaviorally oriented so-called causes of the racial wealth gap, and be able to say, you're right, it accounts for something, but in the scheme of things, it's pretty minuscule, and if you're serious about the racial wealth gap, let's focus on the most important drivers. So let me stop there for the moment. I'm sure that a lot more conversation will come up.
Thank you so much for sharing your groundbreaking research and findings with us that we are going to continue to explore. But Barbara, I'd like to turn things over to you now to have you both comment on Tom's findings, but also draw upon your own work to help us understand the drivers of the racial wealth gap.
Thank you, Mariko. Tom, can you pass the clipper? Thank you. First,
I wanted to thank Anne and Roger and Kololo for putting together this wonderful. I've been with this group since the beginning in 2004 at Tuskegee, so it's really great to be with everyone and to have a conversation, especially at this really historic juncture. So moving ahead, I wanted to remind people where the minority population in the United States actually is concentrated. So I thought it would be a good reminder to come up with a visual mapping. We find ourselves in interesting places. To reiterate, with respect to the wealth gap, this is a different survey. It's the Survey of Consumer Finances, put out every 3 years by the Board of Governors. And it basically sends us back to the 1900s, or not the 1900s, 1990s, in terms of median wealth. And median wealth is pretty disturbing when it comes to the difference between median and mean. So we really are talking about half of the population actually being below that and half above. So we're talking some big erosion. And finally, I want to bring into the picture, because part of what I'm going to talk about with Tom's results are very important. We are now seeing returning to multi-generational status data that we haven't seen since World War II, since the beginning of the electrification of the United States. We are seeing almost 40% of families, households, now living in multi-generational units. So it's going to have a really big impact with respect to job creation, with respect to housing development, but also with respect to moving forward and what it really means in terms of families and how families arrange themselves. So the questions on the table for me are, why have researchers in academic disciplines failed to fully capture the spillover effects of home ownership? We kind of know always in terms of the monetized value of housing and housing markets. We look at it simply as an investment when we also know that it's a consumption item, but it's more than a consumption item. It also has long-run implications for family stability and for community anchoring. We know that. We haven't done any counterfactuals to actually say, and this is what the returns are on home ownership and what the counterfactual would be if we didn't have that information. So one of the challenges that we have is actually pausing, looking at the positive spillover effects, and wondering what would have been the consequence for this community had there not been home ownership. We haven't done that counterfactual. We need to. It's part of recognizing that home ownership isn't just the investment vehicle, it's also part of stabilizing families, communities, and anchoring our civic engagement. We know from studies that families living in their own homes have a higher probability of children finishing high school. We know that the children growing up in families who own homes have a higher probability of being a homeowner themselves. We also know that children and families growing up in their own homes have higher political participation rates, higher civic engagement. So these are only 3 of the many positive spillover effects of home ownership. And we're looking at home ownership only in terms of investment. So this is one of our challenges. The other challenge is what the role will be for our institutions that we've taken for granted for a very long time. Now that we've had the Great Recession, now that we're beginning to look at a 21st landscape, not only in job creation, but in job training and in job mobility, we're also looking at new ways of facing the housing market and the recovery of the housing market. What are we going to be asking of our institutions? Are we going to be asking them to be siloized like they have in the past? Or will we be asking them to be more comprehensive in terms of what kind of services they deliver? Finally, I submit that we're in a new age of little data and big data. We've just come off the election where everybody was looking at the polls, if not every day, every other day. And we have become a very data-oriented society. We produce it, We analyze it. We now have become almost a consumer, expert on dashboard analytics in one way or another. So this is a time to now be using data to benefit our communities, and we can be doing it in real time. So one way that our communities can actually advocate for themselves is to have the evidence in a timely way and not have to wait 5 years to get the evidence. This is about helping communities, in a sense, have a little bit of what the campaign was all about. How do you get the information? How do you implement it? And how do you get the outcomes? So, communities at the table is part of what I think this conversation is about and the wealth divide is about. Because it's in communities where the wealth erosion has happened. So with that, I kind of close off and open the floor.
Hi, so my question kind of relates to a previous one about income. I was wondering, over recent decades, really, we've seen an increase in income inequality, and I think also an increase in wealth inequality. And I was wondering if any of the panelists can kind of connect us, do a sort of a race and class analysis to help us understand how these things might be connected to each other. And also, I guess more broadly, I guess the drivers of that, and how can we work to both reduce wealth inequality generally and also income inequality generally, and which I presume would have beneficial effects in terms of reducing the racial wealth divide. But it's a question.
Thank you for that set of questions. So the second largest key driver in the increase in the racial wealth gap has to do with dynamics around work and pay. It's been, we clearly need to identify it and elevate it, and to think very seriously about the kinds of policies that would remedy that. I think it certainly in that basket has to do with a living wage, far beyond the minimum wage, but I also think it has to do with benefits, especially around retirement security, health care benefits, and others as well. I don't remember the exact dating on this, and maybe my colleague at the Fed will remember. I don't want to put her on the spot. But if we were to look at a graph around worker productivity, post-World War II worker productivity, in the period right after World War II, there's a near doubling of productivity in the United States. And for the most part, that productivity is shared. The living standard of most groups, whether it's racial, ethnic, age, gender, nearly doubles between about 1950 and the late 1960s. Now, the middle story I want to skip over, but it's the last part of the story that we're in, where 0% of the productivity has been distributed through the wage or through wealth to anybody outside of the top 1%. And that happens out of diminishing power of unions, policies, tax preferential policies around the wealthy, around capital gains, how interest is treated, all of those kinds of policies that were changed from previous eras to specifically benefit those at the very top. So the stagnation, if you will, in the living standard of typical American families and workers is not out of lack of productivity. It's lack of how that productivity has been shared. It's been going to essentially the very, very top 1% again? Those are questions around, or lack of questions around labor economics, around the ability to make that distribution much more equitable, however we want to define that.
And we also have, I think, a disconnect, and it's a conversation that I continue to have with my colleagues in communications and in marketing. There was, I think, a legacy in a time when the U.S. workforce understood that it was also a consumer. And now we tend to have a disconnect between the consumer identity and the worker identity. And so they don't recognize in one person the connection between what you're buying at Walmart is also going to have an impact on what you're going to be bringing home. And if part of free enterprise is about price decreases, then we're going to see this reflected also in the workers' wage scale. Now, another issue that we haven't seen is since the 1960s, occupational status and how you value that with respect to where it's placed in the economic sector and the industry hasn't been revisited. And I submit, I really believe that this is a time that we need to be rethinking this, especially after 9/11, is that we have food security. And this is one job sector that's not, that can't be exported. So those who work in the food sector industry should get a national security premium precisely because this is an area, provided they can keep the food sources safe.
Now, wealth disparity between black and white Americans persists due to a complex interplay of historical injustices, systemic barriers, and ongoing discriminatory practices. Centuries of slavery stripped black families of economic opportunities, denying them wealth accumulation through land, labor, or inheritance. Post-slavery, policies like Jim Crow laws, redlining, and discriminatory lending systematically excluded black Americans from home ownership, quality education, and well-paying jobs, key drivers of wealth. For instance, redlining in the mid-20th century prevented black families from buying homes in appreciating neighborhoods, while white families benefited from subsidized loans, building generational wealth through property. These historical inequalities compound across generations. White families with inherited wealth can invest in education, business, or property, while black families often lack such resources, facing higher debt burdens. Black college graduates, for example, have nearly double the student loan debt of white peers. The racial wage gap also persists. Black workers earn about 7 cents for every dollar earned by a white worker, limiting savings and investments. Contemporary policies often fail to address this gap. Tax structures favor wealth disproportionately held by whites over income, and social safety nets are underfunded, disproportionately affecting black communities. Incarceration rates driven by biased policing disrupt black families' economic stabilities. Black men are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white men. Meanwhile, cultural narratives blaming black poverty on individual failings ignore structural realities, deflecting from systemic reforms. Efforts to close the gap, like affirmative action or reparations proposals, face political resistance and are often diluted or underfunded without transformative interventions, such as wealth redistribution, equitable education funding, or housing reform. The gap exemplified by white households having 10 times the median wealth of black households remains entrenched. This persistent disparity reflects not just history, but a failure to dismantle the systems perpetuating it. So that it is from us today. Tell us down in the comment section what you think about it. And if you're watching us for the first time, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and also share. Thank you, and may the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.